So I'm from Ethics Table A, and for us, the question was, what are some of the key ethical issues in terms of treatment, thinking about translating things to clinical trials, and really the options that patients have. So the two key areas where these ethical issues arise is in terms of the clinical trials themselves and questions about communication. So what are the expectations of the patient from the treatment and the importance of that really being clear. And then in terms of the trials themselves, the question of how the technical things such as having a placebo group in a stage 1 trial, and if you are delivering a treatment through the spine, for example, what are the implications for patients in undertaking this process, knowing that they might be going through this quite invasive procedure and not actually receiving the drug in itself. So that was one of some of these questions that came up. And then also the possibility, how other ways of measuring these things that might mean that a placebo group isn't even necessary. And so that's very important in drug development. As I mentioned earlier, the communication aspect is very important. So we talked quite a bit about genetic testing, about how this might flow through to assistive reproductive technologies as well. We agreed that there is going to be cultural variance internationally. So okay, there is going to be cultural variance. There are going to be differing ideas about individual rights to know versus kind of social embeddedness and families. But we agreed that there should be some kind of international standards that are set to enable, those starting points in discussion as well. So that might be a good thing to work towards as this international group. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The second ethics table.
Hi, I think some of the concerns were the same, of course, which is good. And so besides the issues of clinical trials that haven't been addressed, we also consider the fact that being a rare disease and with few patients to study, we need collaborative studies. So we need data flow. We need to, so there's issues related with data sharing and storage and the standardization of this and the issues of privacy that these databases have. So we're discussing about that. So the international standardization as an action plan is very important it was very important to us in our discussion. International standardization of data collection, sharing, and storage. And we know that for MJD, we know there are global initiatives, there are European and American initiatives. So I think that this effort is underway. Natural history studies are very important and standardized in a standardized manner also, and they are ongoing. And also quality of life indicators to be used also in clinical trials will be important, and maybe patients' associations can help in determining which indicators would be better in their own community of patients so that we can use them in clinical trials. Also, informed consent is a concern. It's important to ask patients if they are getting consents that they can clearly understand, and if the consent is being considered a process rather than a document that you make patients sign. This, for us, I think is very important.
Thank you. We're next going to hear from the global collaboration tables.
So I promised you that I tried to catch a break, but it was denied to me, so I will be speaking to you again. All right, so we first thought about, and our apologies, we didn't get to timelines, but we thought about what are the incentives and why do we care about having global collaboration. So firstly, that there are many more researchers in Europe and the United States, and not a ton of funding, but a little bit more funding. Yet we have seen, I think, from this meeting so far, that the size of the numbers of patients and family with the disease are much greater in lower resource settings or places that often are not as tapped into with the global community, for example in China, and as well in low resource settings like Brazil. We talked about a paradigm shift that currently research, of course, funding focuses on those researchers who are more senior and have a track record. And maybe we could think about having a look at prioritizing the merit overall of work. And only through collaboration do we then really see what the potential is. We also spoke about the real possibility of increasing health disparities if we don't all work together globally, and that we know from other treatments that if we don't equally trial medications equally in males as well as females in different subpopulations, we know from Brazil and other places the phenotypes and genotypes are different among populations, that we really risk increasing that disparity. And so some of our ideas that we had were to really leverage opportunities like this as far as conferences go. We know that they're expensive. So perhaps finding out some of these larger conferences that have much more funding than, for example, smaller patient organizations, that we could, try to increase the SCA3 and MJD presence there. Just map where are the patient organizations around the world. Start with a real assessment of that and how can we find each other and work together, maybe pool funding, as well as looking at the collaborative grants and asking funding bodies to think about maybe requirements on you need 3+ countries, and it needs to be multidisciplinary to be successful. As well as promoting SCA Global, which is newly kind of forming around getting clinicians together, that we could think about how to increase basic scientists in that work. And also we spoke about that it really energizes the people who work in basic science to pursue, because the work can become mundane. So those are ideas.
There's a second table about global collaboration. You're next.
It's like the weather. I'm the gorgeous lady, apparently.
Okay. Well, we covered a number of similar themes to the previous speaker, but we certainly reinforced the importance of holding conferences such as this, and continuing to do it on the back of IARC conferences and others that make it more effective in terms of getting people to be able to attend. We saw the opportunity for the conferences over time to become more focused, given some of the developments that are going on in terms of potential treatments. Clearly some more focus around what are the options and how they might be progressed. There's some very significant issues around raising funding for clinical trials that people are coming up against. And there's a whole question of how we continue to collaborate around support and where the priorities might lie. There's also issues around young researchers coming through. Was raised about support for young researchers to be able to attend conferences such as this, in terms of getting them sort of built into the process, and encouraging them to stay the course. We also saw that in the importance of relationship building, that one of the benefits of conferences such as this is not too large. There is a sort of family of MJD researchers around the world, and the collaboration's already been developed or to be built upon. We also talked about the whole question of patient input. And there was a good example used at the NAF here in the States where patients get to interrogate researchers about what they're doing, about the priorities, about the issues. There's, as Desiree mentioned, there's significant cultural variations around the world in terms of issues about preparing people for human trials. issues about what people would prefer by way of invasive types of treatments that might be emerging comparatively, and issues. And so the importance to us to look at ways of how we might join up with things like NAF to allow, I know from our perspective, people and that opportunity to share with other patients about the issues from a joint perspective, building confidence in what's going on and be able to, we even heard the example of one organisation who actually set up its own lab and hired its own scientists to assess what all the treatments are and what is the best, might be the most effective for them. So patients having a real input. That's a bit challenging for some researchers, but we think it's a laudable and appropriate approach. And we also talked about the importance of promoting resource sharing. Okay, stop.
Thank you. Next, going to hear from the tables that discussed cross-discipline collaboration.
So the main question was how to improve the collaboration between basic scientists and clinicians. So we thought about the gaps we have between these two different areas. So clinicians would need better animal models and more understanding about how these models actually recapitulate the disease phenotype. So this is one point. And the other is that researchers would also need to get more information from clinicians about biomarkers, about what is relevant in terms of the disease phenotype. So this discussion would be important. And we also had the point of the industry. So industry would benefit from both situations. So better models and better biomarkers to help them to design clinical trials. So this will be the gaps and how to improve that. So we thought about basically trying to foster collaboration and trying to design or build some sort of biobanks that we could gather together information about, CSF samples, blood samples, DNA, clinical data, imaging, both from patients and also from models. And these biobanks would be available for a huge amount of physicians and researchers interested in the disease. And such biobanks would need funding, of course, and that would be an effort that would involve not only industry, but also government, universities, patient advocacy groups. So there would be a general effort from all those stakeholders, we think. That would be, I think, our ideas.
Hello. Interestingly, we had very different ideas to the other table. So our discussion was mainly about, it started with what barriers there are to collaborating. So we thought physical separation. Often basic researchers and clinicians are in separate buildings or sometimes separate states. So that physical separation makes it really difficult. Lack of patient groups in Brazil and Portugal. That also is a barrier to collaborating. And as it's already been discussed, the cultural variance. That can make international collaborations a bit more complex. But some things that we thought fostered collaborations were the establishment of programs which link clinicians with researchers. We also thought it was important for researchers to meet with patients face-to-face, because that could increase the understanding for the researchers of the clinical perspective. And we also thought initiating collaboration at earlier stages, as in career stages. So our plan of action was to establish multidisciplinary teams, which in a centralised location, which allows face-to-face interaction of patients, clinicians, researchers, and genetic counsellors. And initiating those collaborations at earlier career stages, because that could allow more fruitful long-term collaborations. And also we thought promotion of PhD, MD programs might also help foster collaboration. That was it.
Thank you. We're next going to hear from patient and family engagement.
This is not the microphone. Okay. So our team, we're talking about patient and family engagement. And our first question was, how can we promote engagement of people living with MJD and their families in research and get the research findings out to people in an accurate and timely way? So we had a lot of ideas and we sort of came up with the next steps as we went along. how can we get families involved? Some ideas were provide get to know each other opportunities and in the different areas that people are, and this would be ideal if it was led by families themselves. People in different areas of the world can feel quite isolated, so having those opportunities for people to connect would be good. Having families involved in research, on research teams from the beginning is really important. How can we get people involved? We talked about really using whatever avenues are available and possible. So whether that's personally contacting people, using other avenues like Facebook, Twitter, websites, getting the information out through any and all of the associations that we have. Felt a lot of our table talking about that families are ready and keen to be part of everything, but talking about, well, how can people how can families let researchers know that they're ready to go and ready to be part of research? So we talked about having some sort of central database where people can get in touch and say, yeah, I'm ready, let me know when there's something that comes up, or let me know that we can be interested. So whether associations group together to form some sort of alliance, because there are a number of MJD associations. So how can we come together under one umbrella and have some sort of centralised way of everyone to be together? Hang on, there's one more. No, that's all right. Yep. Oh, having open days. Oh, come on. 1 second. Yes. Have gatekeepers in every association to get messages out. It's the researcher's responsibility to get your message out about your research so that everyone can know about it, not just in a journal article. Remember that not all areas have their own associations, so it's important for people with MJD to just be part of one or become involved in one, and then all of our associations need to cross-communicate. So whatever's happening in another place, we can all know about it. So we're all one big family. Thank you.
There's another table, I think, about patient and family engagement.
Yeah, that's us. So I think we took a little bit more general approach and with the kind of key focus of promote engagement and distill the research to the actual patients. I think the key message was, oh, you left me now, to increase awareness and to really raise awareness about ataxia and Machado-Rosas disease in the general population. And in particular, also to give back to the patients by really explaining in depth to the patient. I think one of the key risks or potential pitfalls we currently see is that patients may just not want to disclose the disease and may not want to kind of bear the risks of social isolation. I think that's why we felt that this communication, in particular through patient organizations or the attending clinicians, would be of relevance. And so, again, staying within the general approach, we just felt that raising apparent awareness of patients with governments, with the general public would be of key instrumental impact to just moving this forward. And I think we discussed other indications like Huntington's, for example, SMA, where these global organizations put a lot of pressure and awareness that now I think translates into also drug companies coming forward and moving forward. And then the same obviously doing for the patients. So we have really just this need to explain in more detail to the patients the actual benefits and obvious risks, so basically of what you have discussed. Anything? Okay.
Next we'll hear from clinical care.
So this is always daunting as a non-clinician, talking to clinical care and then having patients and carers in the room as well. So I'm going to be very careful in what I say, in terms of that. But in terms of the discussion, I think we didn't get to timelines, but in terms of the action plan, I think certainly from experiences in other disease areas, I think when you have general practitioners who are dealing with these patients and having to identify, particular diseases, the resources available to them, can be quite limiting. And so one of the ideas was to try and identify when they're identifying the patients, to have the necessary resources, whether it's clinical guidelines, treatment centers of excellence, where they can actually refer these patients that are coming in. And it could be at a very high level. It could be from a movement disorder point, then going into terms of what could be the actual genetics. It could be Parkinson's, it could be MJD, it could be anything else. The other point there is, being here for the last day, it's very clear in terms of the cultural differences that you have in the various MJD centers, whether they're in the Azores or in Australia or in Israel, and having culturally tailored treatment plans. I think it is not one size fits all. It has to be tailored. And then having referrals into community support groups, education and counseling for multidisciplinary teams that may be able to help. I think it's quite a critical part of that. The next point is around patients having a platform for home-based therapeutic, and whether that's occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, counseling, in order, so even after they made the diagnosis and you have the resources, how do they follow through, how they can adhere to it. And of course, a lot of the other people have already touched on advocacy initiatives, trying to get multiple stakeholders together, that's patients, researchers, etc. And I can talk a little bit from one of the experiences for FTD, which is, if I can just say this, where it's a big initiative. It's the Genetic FTD Initiative, which is a US, UK, Canada, and they've got like 900 patients with mutations for various FTDs. And what they've been doing is, there's no therapeutics, but they've been collating these natural histories so that now that the therapeutics are becoming available, they're leveraging that database to say, we can now identify, we can pull in those patients to you. And I think that's probably quite a good example, one of probably many examples where doing the work is not futile, because ultimately therapeutics will become available. But then you have to be prepared. How do we progress that at that point?
So we were also answering the question around clinical guidelines, but also self-management recommendations for clients. And we were discussing the fact that a lot of these guidelines already exist, but that dissemination and sharing of these resources is one of our biggest challenges. And we were also talking about the fact that there's not a great need for MJD specific resources, but there's an opportunity to work with others, working with other progressive ataxias in working together to develop those more general guidelines based on symptoms that can then be localised to each community from both a cultural perspective, but also really importantly from a resource perspective in terms of what is available and practical for that community of people. We talked about one of the biggest challenges associated with clinical guidelines and self-management guidelines being the process of making sure that these are updated and kept relevant with the progression of research. So in terms of an action plan, we spoke about the need for a network to be developed between patient organisations, providers of clinical services and researchers in order to achieve some of this dissemination, but also help in the collaborative update of these resources.
Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in the discussion this morning. It's really exciting to have this opportunity to be all sharing our ideas. So we're about to go for a break, but just a couple of things before we do. If you can make sure that the papers from your table are brought forward, maybe just, in front of this table here at the front. That's please write your table number and the title of your discussion topic. If you're happy to bring those forward, we'll make sure that somebody is collating all of that from this morning, and we'll be disseminating that information to all of the delegates from the conference. So thank you for your participation. Just a reminder about the Menti website, www.menti.com, to send your questions for people living with MJD for our panel later. The code is 170050, and we'll make sure that that's on the screen in the break as well. So we're about to break for 30 minutes. We'll be back here at 10:45. Thanks.